Hello, how's everyone doing? We were back there having our own therapy just now. Everyone out here was nodding, right? I feel like I had to make an appointment at this point in time. So I'm glad you're all here. Listen, I want to bring out our panel because honestly, I want people to be able to define themselves. So come on out. That's one of the issues we always have in this world. Come on out, everyone. What I'd love to do while you're all getting situated and seated, and look at this crowd who is eager to hear about your expertise, and really to get into the conversation of what my father used to always say, which is words matter, Laura. Every word matters. And the word sentencing reminds me obviously of sentence, which means there's some kind of end to it. And people think that there's a period at the end of sentencing. Really, it's an ellipse, right? It's dot, 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 because then what? And what does it mean when you're actually there? And is it the right thing to do, and what else can be done? So I want to go through and with you all, and just say your name. Tell me the perspective that you're coming from in your work that you're doing, and introduce yourselves as to why this is so important.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Satana DeBerry. I am the elected district attorney in Durham County, North Carolina. I am a two-term district attorney. Did somebody say yay?
Yeah.
I assume that I am on this panel because prosecutors are really where sentencing starts. We make those recommendations to the court. And in my office, what we have tried to do really is do this in a way that is fair and just. You know, you've had a whole morning now of people talking about a system that's neither fair nor just, right? And so what we try to do is only sentence people for whom there is no other option. If there are other options than prison, we want those other options. We want to divert people from the justice system. And so I look forward to talking a little bit more about that.
That's important. Go ahead, Judge.
Hi, I'm Judge Karen Friedman. I was a judge in Baltimore for over 20 years, and now I'm at the Department of Justice as the Director of Criminal Justice, Innovation, Development, and Engagement. Really long title. It does fit on a business card, but really, really small font. But I'm here today in my capacity as a former trial court judge, like I said, for over 2 decades. And what I'm here to say is that judges have, state court judges specifically, have a lot of discretion in sentencing. And my philosophy is that judges can and should sentence therapeutically and think about the underlying conditions that the individual who is appearing in front of them is facing. When you are a judge and an individual's in front of you, you get their record. And I would see records that were pages long. And at some point, you have to stop and say, why? Why does this individual's record look this way? And generally, it was because there was either a substance use problem, a mental health issue, homelessness, lack of a job, lack of education. Putting someone in jail, it is not going to solve those problems. And 97% of the people who are incarcerated at this very moment in time, at some point will be back in the community. And if those underlying conditions are not addressed, they're going to be a public safety risk again, and they're going to be back in the system again. So we need to address the underlying conditions, and judges have the ability to do that, to really invest themselves in the individuals that come in front of them, learn who they are, and learn what they need. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing.
So important.
So good afternoon. My name's Nicole. I work at the Sentencing Project, which is a research and advocacy organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. We do research and advocacy to challenge mass incarceration and call attention to the fact that 2023 is actually the 50th year of mass incarceration. 1973 is when the prison population started to surge. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, including increased contact with the police starting in the 70s and 80s, the adoption of excessive sentencing laws like mandatory minimum sentences that take away discretion from judges, even though there are discretionary practices that judges still have authority over. But mandatory sentencing laws have really contributed to sending people to prison regardless of the circumstances of the crime and lengthening terms of confinement in prison. So I bring that perspective here. And also the fact that when we talk about sentencing alternatives, a lot of that space over the last 30 years has been focused on nonviolent offenses, which is very important. The drug war contributed to disappearing people to prisons and jails in the 80s and 90s, many times for first-time offenses, sometimes for life imprisonment for certain drug offenses. That said, the majority of people incarcerated at the state level are actually incarcerated for violent offenses. So when we talk about alternatives, we also have to look at options for violent offenses that include homicide. And I know that there's some exciting work, important work happening in Durham that I hope that the DA can speak to, and I've looked at it, so I want to speak to it as well. But also for other convictions that are classified as violent, such as robbery, serious property offenses. What are alternatives that can be offered for those types of offenses? And how can the public help to support that so that people can be held accountable but not disappeared and warehoused in the cages and prisons that dominate the United States? So that's the perspective that I'm going to bring this afternoon.
Wow.
Hi, my name is Jason Pye. I am the director of... She deserves it, please, please, sorry.
None of us are personally offended if you do not do the blow-by-blow applause. We will assume it's there.
I expect no applause. My name is Jason Pye. I'm the director of Rule of Law Initiatives for the Due Process Institute. Prior to that, I spent 6.5 years at FreedomWorks, which is a conservative and libertarian organization based in Washington, D.C. So I come from a center-right perspective, libertarian perspective on criminal justice reform issues. And you're going to see me nodding along a lot, despite the fact that I may have some ideological differences with my co-panelists, because everything I've heard thus far are things I completely agree with. In terms of my work on this, I've worked on the First Step Act. I've spent an inordinate amount of time in 2017, 2018 trying to get the First Step Act passed in the House and the Senate, as well as signed into law. Worked closely with Jared Kushner and the Office of American Innovation inside the White House, and I've also been fortunate enough to work on the Fair Chance Act, which was included in the National Defense Authorization Act, as well as restoring Pell Grant opportunities for people who are incarcerated. So I'm very much looking forward to this panel because I have a lot to say, as well as things that are happening as soon as next week in the United States Senate.
Well, now that we know a little bit more about the perspectives you bring, I really want to get right into it because we all know that we have a legal system in this country that's often in search of a justice system. Because what we often do is we are uncreative about what the result should be for what somebody has done wrong, how we judge accountability, how we approach accountability, how we think about all the different factors in one's life that might lead you to be in a certain circumstance that then we define you as for the rest of your life. When you think about the fact that crime does exist, I'll start with you. Crime exists. And we know that in communities, we do not want crime to exist. We know that we want to all feel collectively safe and safety around us. And yet there's this tension for so many people, particularly people of color, in trying to, on the one hand, advocate for safety, and on the other hand, understanding that the justice system, quote unquote, is not always pursuing it fairly. Do you ever feel that tension in terms of going up for sentencing and advocating for something and feeling like you have a battle of allegiance?
Tough one.
Wow.
I'm starting light.
Yeah, start light. I don't know that I have a battle of allegiance. What I will say is that everybody deserves to feel safe. And we know that, especially as people of color, we are almost everywhere unsafe, right? And crime is so sticky, right? The fear of crime is so sticky because we have a negativity bias as humans, right? You can't eat poison but once. And everybody is like, I can't survive a violent act, so I don't want to have anything happen to me.
That sounds reasonable, though.
Sounds
to the body.
reasonable. It sounds reasonable. And because, and I'm not going to pick on you, but on the media a little bit, everybody thinks they're always in danger of violence because that's all we hear about. You know, we don't hear about anything else happening in our communities. All we hear is how unsafe our communities are. And so, for me, people of color, like, people know how they're treated when they're defendants, right? They know that they're treated poorly. And so when they're a victim, they want you to treat a defendant just as poorly, right? Because they've been the victim too. And so I think that's where the tension is, right? Is like you said, crime does actually exist. Violent crime does actually exist. There are people that I do have to put in prison. But out of the 30,000 cases, criminal cases that are filed with my office every year, fewer than 6% of those are violent, right? So that means there are thousands of cases for which we can make a different decision.
Yeah.
And we don't have to keep doing the same thing. Everybody's afraid that, well, if I let this person go, then they might commit another crime. Well, there's a big difference between smoking marijuana in the park and homicide. And just because somebody's smoking marijuana in the park doesn't mean tomorrow they're going to go out and kill somebody. And so we have to start talking honestly about what our caseloads look like as prosecutors, what we're actually prosecuting. We don't have to go hard on everything, right? Because we know if I send somebody to prison today, when they come out, they're not going to have the education that they need. They're not going to have the job skills that they need. They're not going to have anything that they need to reintegrate back into society. And they're going to have a mother or a baby's mama or somebody who's like, man, you've been gone for 4, 5, 6 years. I've been having to hold it down. You got to make some money. And if you don't have any education, if you don't have any skills, there are very few ways to make money. Legal ways to make money. And so we really have to take, what we try to do in my office is take all that into account. Who do we want to come home, right? And who do we want to send away?
That's the question. I mean, I want to get into that too because and I come from this as a former federal prosecutor. So be it far from me to tell you or try to pretend as though we don't have the complexities in those decisions. And the amount of prosecutorial discretion one has is terrifying. It really is how much power one individual has to decide what you're going to suggest to a judge about what this person's life for the next whatever amount of years should be. But the sentencing alternatives, we hear about drug courts, right? We hear about mental health treatment. We hear about domestic violence prevention. We hear about what and who the person should be doing when they come home. Is that reasonable, though, when you look at how sentencing works, Nicole?
Well, I think part of the solution is building an infrastructure in the community so that those alternatives can be real options that judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys can be directing their defendants to, most of whom are Black in this country. You know, the United States built prisons, really scaled up the prison system in the 80s and the 90s, rather than investing in the community. And in fact, we went through a disinvestment of communities, particularly in the 80s under the Reagan administration. And rather than directing resources into building up community-based programs that might offer the mental health support given the previous panel, that might offer supports for folks at risk of committing domestic violence, and providing violence alternatives programs, that instead of doing that, we built up prisons. We created a Marshall program, a carceral Marshall program that really expanded the prison footprint. So this country has made choices. The fact that we rely on sentencing and disappear people to prison is a political choice of lawmakers that has dominated not just the criminal legal system for the past 50 years, but social policy.
What about money, though? I mean, you build a prison,
Budgets
it's
are
about money as well.
Yeah, no, budgets are a choice. How the federal government focuses its resources is a choice. How state governments focus their resources is a choice. So the fact that in the early 90s, there was major federal legislation that incentivized states to expand their prison population was a choice of not just policy, but also budgets that helped drive resources into the states to expand the prison footprint. And so it can be a choice that lawmakers at the federal level and within states make, and at the local level, district attorneys to local police chiefs can make to say that people should not be disappeared into the criminal legal system. They remain community members. We should figure out a way to support them in their homes, because disappearing someone doesn't just impact the individual, it also impacts families, it also impacts communities. Those are choices that lawmakers could make in the next 50 years.
And I want everyone to know, I'm gonna get you 1 second, but I want everyone to know, do you realize that if you have a prison in your area, the census counts them as people in your community? Which means, guess what? There are resources that are then going to go to a community that will not be actually enjoyed or appreciated or used at all by the people who are comprising a lot of that census count. So you can imagine communities that say, oh, we'll take a prison, I'll add to my numbers, I'll get different benefits, and I never have to deal with what is coming with that. You worked on a lot of these issues in terms of figuring out why this is big business and why there can't be as many alternatives.
Well, one of the things I wanted to say in terms of, you mentioned accountability courts, drug courts specifically, and my home state is Georgia, and since we have a big game tomorrow, I'll say go Dogs. But I wanted to point out that some states, Georgia, Texas, Rhode Island, others, red and blue across the political spectrum, have actually enacted a number of reforms, including drug courts and diversion programs. Georgia has saved $264 million as a result of its reforms, reinvested $57 million into reducing recidivism. Recidivism dropped from around 30% to 25.3%. And accountability courts in Georgia are nearly half the cost of probation. It costs $13,057 for a 24-month program in Georgia, the accountability court program, and $24,801 to keep someone on probation. In Texas, the savings have eclipsed $3 billion since they enacted their reforms in 2006. They've closed 10 prisons, and recidivism is now 20.3%. So the thing is, unfortunately, in 2007 and then in 2011, when Governor Deal in Georgia began doing his reforms, the political landscape has changed. Part of it's because of hyperpartisanship in Congress and elsewhere, which is unfortunate. Both right and left are guilty of it, more so the right these days than anybody else, though, and I'm happy to say that, because it's true. But the political atmosphere has shifted so much that it's become harder to pursue these largely bipartisan policies, but we've got to continue to focus on ways to reduce recidivism. That includes continuing to expand accountability courts and specialty courts, drug courts, veterans courts, mental health courts, so on and so forth. But it also includes pursuing other second chance initiatives like record sealing and expungement. We want people to go to work, to find jobs, to become productive tax-paying citizens, but we don't provide them with any of the tools to do it. That has to change.
So Laura, I was a drug court judge. I was the drug court judge for Baltimore on both the misdemeanor and the felony level. And the BJA, where I work now, we fund all the drug courts and DUI courts and mental health courts. I'm a very big proponent of it, obviously. My issue is what we do is we pick certain judges to be in these treatment courts. And we give them very specific training. We teach them about active listening, motivational interviewing, about community resources, about empathy, about addiction, about mental health. But we don't train any of the other judges. And there are very limited people who are eligible for drug court, mental health court. There are statutory restrictions, there are judicial restrictions, there are a bunch of reasons that people don't get into the treatment courts. So that means that problem that that individual is dealing with is going to a regular court. And the judge that they're in front of hasn't been trained the same way that the treatment court judges were trained. But why? They're dealing with the exact same problems that the specialty courts are dealing with. So that was why I already had the mindset of therapeutic jurisprudence because of my training in the drug courts. So when I was in my regular docket, I treated the individuals who came in front of me with those exact same skills. And I went out into the community myself and found substance use providers who would come sit in my courtroom, mental health providers who would come and sit in my courtroom, vocational programs that would come sit. So when an individual came in front of me in a regular docket, I would have those same resources to use to help that individual. So I want to see more judges being able to use those specialty court skills on their regular dockets and really come to their docket with the therapeutic jurisprudence lens.
Well, it sounds like that's a marching order, right? It sounds like it's a marching order, that there shouldn't be an optional training, what you describe. I mean, just the phrase motivational interviewing, therapeutic jurisprudence, thinking about ways in which, why would that be confined to just the judges? But what do you say to what the DA had to say about, and to your larger point about the media's role in making people feel as though, and campaigns capitalize on this all the time. They want you to feel afraid. They want you to think that they're the party or they're the candidate that can do more about it. Do you ever feel as though judges are subliminally trained to not be, quote unquote, soft on crime? We saw what happened with Justice Ketanji, right, Brown Jackson, when a public defender and a judge was accused of being soft on crime because she considered the constitutional rights of an individual human being. That was soft on crime for some reason. Did you ever feel like judges are forced, their hands are forced for that reason?
I mean, judges are human, right? And we worry about our careers just like everyone else. And no one wants to be the judge on the front page of the paper, right? To say, oh, you know, Judge Friedman gave this guy a second chance and didn't put him in prison and he went out and did something terrible. We're all scared of that. That's just the reality. So it's definitely something that we think about, and there's and that's especially when it comes to bail and letting people out on bail and worrying that they're going to do something while they're being, waiting for trial. These are definitely things that we think about. But at the end of the day, I mean, I never had I guess I was lucky. I never really had an issue with this because part of what I did was really build relationships with the state and with the public defenders. And they really understood what I was trying to do. And at the end of the day, they knew that if someone had to go to prison, and there are some people that have to go to prison. I have put people in prison, and I'm not embarrassed to say that, okay? There are some people that have done things that they need to go to prison, or they're a serious public safety risk. So they knew at the end of the day that if someone had to go to prison, they were going to go to prison, but they knew that it wasn't going to be the first option, that prison has to be the last alternative. And what I would do a lot is also I would postpone sentencing. So if someone took a plea in front of me and they really needed substance use, they really needed mental health counseling, I would give them that opportunity to do that, push the sentencing out a few months, and see how they did.
What is your body language telling me? I mean, you're turning, so what is it you're saying? Excuse me.
Well, I appreciate what Judge Freeman is saying, but I think we really need to even back up further than that. Like, there are lots of things that just don't need to be in court. Like, I appreciate that she worked with the public defender and worked with the state and had, drug courts and have people coming in and sitting in court. But if you have a significant substance abuse problem, if you have a mental health issue, I am the wrong person to deal with you. Right? Like, you shouldn't, if you are engaged because you live in a place that is highly policed and you sleep outside or you're shooting up or something like that, I don't have any resources as a criminal prosecutor to help you.
It's an important point. I want everyone to look at this stage. Do you happen to see an empty chair? Right? It's by design, because we're all talking about a particular issue, but we haven't talked about what happens when the youth is involved, right? You're talking about what's too late and what shouldn't get to people. I want to bring out our additional panelist. Xavier, can you come on out, please? Because, no, he's not a child. I set you up. You're not a child, but I'm talking about this man because, and I want you to introduce yourself to people as well, but I'll give a little bit of a background. He is the executive director for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth and the co-founder of the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. Tell us a little bit as to why that chair need not be empty, because this and all these conversations directly impact even people with your own personal journey.
I would first say, because I was very nervous, I would love to have been out here sooner, but I recognize the intuition, and I appreciate looking across this room and seeing many youth in this space. What I was listening backstage, I just thought to myself, I have a child, 12-year-old child. Not long ago, we went to watch the Spider-Man movie, the Spider-Verse. And I couldn't help but to think about, what if there was like alternative universes for the child of Xavier when he was growing up? When I grew up in back of the yards on the south side of Chicago, I was a child that very early on, at the age of 6 years old, was placed into foster care. In fact, that was the very first moment I was placed into a squad car. My brother, my sisters, and I were transported to the police station, and there were entered into child welfare system because of the abuse of my alcoholic stepfather. After 2.5 years being in that space of being abused by yet another adult, our foster mother, my mother finally convinced him to allow us to come back home. And I'll never forget meeting yet again another abusive stepfather. At the very age of 9 years old, I got my very first arrest for stealing a candy bar from a grocery store. Soon after, for picking parking meters. And soon after, for sleeping in abandoned buildings, trespassing, criminal trespassing the property, damage to property. And sadly, soon after, more serious offenses. By the time I was 13 years old, I had 19 arrests and 7 convictions for armed robberies, aggravated assaults, weapon charges. And ultimately, at the age of 13 years old, I was charged for first-degree murder. A mistake that not a mistake, a decision, and a circumstance that was instantly regretful and remorseful. And sadly, at that very young age of 13, a judge looked at me and said, "You're no longer an adult. You're being tried as an adult. And you're no longer a child, I'm sorry. You're being tried as an adult." And with that swift introduction into the adult system at Cook County Court, soon after, I was given a 25-year sentence. And so I reflect upon my childhood, and I think about that multi-universe. And I think to myself, like, what if I grew up in a world where, I had a full home. My mother wasn't dealing with abuse and neglect. And what if, in some wild universe, when I stepped outside of my home, there wasn't gang graffiti and violence? What if in this wild universe, I didn't have to be exposed to weapons very early on? And at the age of 11 years old, I didn't get shot in my face. I think about the many people in this room who had similar experiences. Many of my brothers and sisters who are in here right now who are part of the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, who are part of ICANN, who were once deemed alongside me years ago as super predators, monsters, kids who were not deserving an opportunity for redemption and second chances. And so before I even proceed to the next question, I want to ask my ICANN brothers and sisters, please stand up. In fact, if you've ever been touched by the system, please stand up. Thank you all. And so I'm here as ambassadors and stand alongside them to advocate for people who were deemed as the worst of the worst, but clearly we're never that. We were never monsters. And so when I hear about alternatives for adults who've committed nonviolent offenses, I get jealous. I get jealous, and a part of me feels a bit enraged because I know that kids have a unique capacity for positive change. And that is what I lead with in our work, and that very strong message that no child is born bad is something I want the whole world to embrace, because what's undeniable to us is that we're never the monsters, and quite frankly, if given an opportunity, we can do amazing and wondrous things in our community, much like our individuals in this room are doing today. So thank you.
Man. I mean, it might surprise people. To me, it's way you, excuse me. I'm a mom, sorry. I'm a mom. Sorry.
Xavier hugged us all before we came on stage.
I know.
He
Yes,
tried.
sir.
You know,
I'm
he
a
tried.
hug,
He tried to shake my hand. I gave him a hug.
I mean,
Yeah, he's a really beautiful person. He's my friend, as are these people out here.
well, you know what it is? He said, Judge, you're no longer a child. It's impossible for me to look at this in a vacuum with the way the world is right now and the expectations we put on children, and also hearing about what our conversations are. And the word you use, disappearing an individual.
But the judge should have never said that to you. I mean, that was an unacceptable thing to say. And I think whatever this work contributes to, changing norms like that, has to be at the center of it. Because the idea that a judge would say to a 13-year-old, I'm sure you looked 13 at the time, although there's studies that say black and brown children, the general public perceives them as older despite their biological age. That's bias, that's racism that contributes to findings like that in studies. But whatever the issue was, it was unacceptable that the judge said that to you, and you didn't deserve that, nor did the tens of thousands of children who were disappeared to the system in the 90s at the height of the super predator scare deserve that either.
So what do you do about it, though? You're talking about policy and legislation. What do you do about it in terms of the advocacy? Is it something, is it the root causes, that's the phrase everyone uses, the root causes? Is it what goes down into the notion of abuse in the home or parental issues? How do you get to that granular level and still make widespread change?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the conversations about alternatives seem to be centered around what happens after the crime. And what I think is very challenging, and perhaps it's about our culture as a country, sadly, is that no one talks about what led up to it. Even in the courtroom, the mitigating factors, and quite frankly, the systemic challenges that exist that are shaped by racism, that are shaped by a lack of opportunity, those biases and misperceptions. And sadly, the presumption of fear and dangerousness that Brian Stevenson talks about, quite frankly, has shaped our lives. And so when we talk about what does it mean to have an alternative to incarceration? Well, we know that 1 out of 3 black children will be in prison someday, will be touched by the system. We cannot accept that as a given. We cannot accept as a given that kids are growing up in communities that are violent, that are really, the atmospheric pressures are leading them in the direction of going into that giant gaping wound of hopelessness, of sadness, of isolation, of not being seen as full human beings, of kids sadly having to be in spaces where they're being talked over and not to and with. And sadly, that is a big part of what has really manifested in really deeply challenging things for us who've been through trauma, and how sadly the system only re-traumatizes, only reinforces the negative sense of self-perception, only strips our self-worth, only does so many things as a child. And quite frankly, with 19 arrests and 7 convictions, looking back upon that experience, I had yet to experience an adult sit down and look me in my eyes and said, Xavier, I understand what you're going through. I know that you're in a home that's challenging. I understand that your mother's dealing with mental illness. I understand that your stepfather is abusive. I understand that when you go to school, you have to go a certain long route to protect yourself, to be safe from rival gangs who assume that you're a gang member. Xavier, I understand you had all these horrible decisions to make very young, and you gave in to the pressures, and now you're on this path. But I want to meet you where you're at. I want to understand what it means to bring joy into your life, to bring safety and well-being. I want to support your family. I want to meet your mom. She's a strong woman, but she has unaddressed and untreated schizophrenia and depression. I want to meet your brother who's going through the same. I want to understand what you're going through. I want to make the world better for you. I can't change everything, but I can at least start with you, and hopefully I can be an extension of the support that you need. No one ever in my life, of all those 19 arrests and 7 convictions, ever had a conversation like that with me. And I think that is a problem. It needs to begin not after the crime, but before we commit that horrible mistake.
But let me ask you, we know about mitigating factors, right? In the law, people talk about certain things that a judge or a prosecutor, in the exercise of his or her discretion, will put forth to suggest that there are reasons for leniency. There are reasons for a more appropriate sentence or process, therapeutically or otherwise. When you think about all that he has described just now, and I don't want to use you as an example of this, but in the conversation to bring it home, would you have said any of these factors in a pursuit of leniency, and would you have, as a judge, accepted them?
Well, he just wouldn't have been in that situation if I had been the prosecutor. And I think that is really important. Like, you have to know who your DA is.
But not everyone has the luxury of picking who is going to prosecute them.
Well, not everybody, but you do pick who your prosecutor is. And if you, in elections, and if you are engaged in your community, you have to know what the people who are making these decisions stand for. It's a real small number of people. I don't know about how you felt as a federal prosecutor, but certainly when I became a prosecutor, it becomes clear how few people make the decisions.
Yes.
There, mass incarceration, it wasn't like there were 100,000 people making those decisions, right? It is a very small number. In my jurisdiction, 2 people can send you to prison for life, right? And so it is important to know who's running these systems, who the judges are in these courtrooms. And I don't think we should be talking about leniency. We should be talking about what accountability looks like. What happened to Xavier was punishment, right? And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to hold people accountable. Everybody makes mistakes. Some of those mistakes are horrible, and some of them are violent, and we only have certain ways that we can deal with those. But for the vast majority of people, accountability can look very different.
Well, Your Honor, would you have chosen? I mean, when people are talking about it, and we know none of us want to be naive about that everyone day-to-day basis has these sort of esoteric conversations about justice. They're getting in and they're getting out. Right. In their courtrooms, day and day, minute by minute. As we've been sitting here today, dare I say there have been 1,000 sentences, right?
Right.
In this country alone.
Yeah.
What about the mitigating circumstances?
Well, I think the issue he raised about no one asking him, for me, that was very key. So when someone came in front of me, I would look at him and say, what brought you here today? And most of the time they look at me, well, I was arrested. I'm like, no. I know that. I have the sheet in front of me. I know that. What in your life has brought you here today? What are the circumstances in your life that has brought you here for this case and with this record? And to really try to, create that relationship, to know what that person is dealing with, and then working from there to figure out what accountability looks like. And most of the people we see have a level of trauma, different levels of trauma, but almost everyone that we encounter every day in the justice system has a level of trauma. It's a matter of figuring out where that's coming from and what can be done to assist and to figure out what accountability looks like considering those factors.
Can I just add? I mean, I think that there is opinion polling that suggests that the general public supports accountability as a response to lawbreaking. But accountability doesn't have to equate to incarceration or imprisonment. So on a different panel, on a different day, I would love to have a longer conversation with the DA and the judge to unpack why prison has to be on the table for some of the defendants that you all have had to make choices around. But accountability can look like participating in a restorative justice program. Victims of property crime, talking with the folks that committed the harm against them. In some studies, restoring the property, restoring what was stolen is enough to the survivor of crime and means accountability to them. So the idea that accountability equates to incarceration, I think is something that we have to get away from and unpack services, programs in the community that touch people, that people are eligible for without being arrested, without being harmed by the criminal legal system, because we know that because of the scope of the criminal legal system, arrest can be traumatizing, and it can result in a fatal outcome given the police brutality that dominates this country. So figuring out what an accountability infrastructure looks like that isn't rooted in incarceration and imprisonment has to be part of the solution, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you all to really unpack that for some of the defendants.
And I want to say one other thing is we're always talking about victims, and there's certainly people who are victims of crime, but that's not how we got to mass incarceration. It was from drug charges and things in which there are no victims.
Yeah, a 50-year war on civil liberties is what it is.
Exactly, except for the people who are incarcerated themselves.
One libertarian, what are you saying? Go ahead.
It's a 50-year war on civil liberties that's cost us over $1 trillion. I follow federal budget numbers just for funsies, I guess. So it's just, I'm a nerd. And we've spent $1 trillion in the war on drugs, and what have we gotten on it? The rates of drug use are just as high. It's just different drugs that people are drawn to these days. One thing I wanted to just briefly touch on, because I know our time is limited, And I mentioned this at the top. Next week, the United States Senate is likely going to vote on a measure, SJ Res 47. Please write that down.
Repeat it.
SJ Res 47. This is sponsored by Senator Marsha Blackburn, who is no friend of criminal justice reform. If this passes, the Senate and the House, thankfully President Biden has issued a veto threat against it, the result will be to undermine the most successful reentry program we have seen created by Congress. It's home confinement under the CARES Act, which was a pandemic era law. 3,400 people could go back to prison before Christmas at the federal level if this measure passes and is signed into law. Now, thankfully, again, Biden has issued a veto threat, but there's always the threat of a veto override. 13,000 people participated in this program. Do you know how many people committed new offenses? 27. That's less than 0.5%, and we're talking about sending 3,400 people back to prison before Christmas. This is the cruelest measure I have seen come up in 10 years in public policy. I just wanted to
Senator Marsha Blackburn's out of Tennessee, and it's SJ Res 47.
call your moderate Democrats. If you're in a state with a moderate Democrat, call them.
Call your Republicans too.
Yeah, no, call your Republicans too. There's a handful of Republicans who are in play. We can get their votes and kill this thing in the Senate. But moderate Democrats also, when they need to hear from people, centrist Republicans, Susan Collins, Mitt Romney, they need to hear from you. John Tester needs to hear from you. Bob Casey needs to hear from you. Make those calls.
And you need not be a constituent specifically geographically of any of these offices to have your hand in justice. Xavier, you had a point.
Yeah, I think the conversation slightly deviated from the point that you made, and I want to just come back to it. And that is, thinking about those who have committed serious violent offenses and what accountability looks like. You talk about competency, public safety, and ensuring that kids have the ability not to reoffend. What was interesting for me, and amongst our community members of former life sentence children, to be more specific, is that we have perhaps even a lower recidivism rate than that, interestingly. And to me, it's not by surprise. When you grow up in the system and you were told you would die in prison, and you go in there as young as 13, 14, 15 years old, and as you're approaching the age of maturity, you start to really reflect upon the consequence of knowing that someday you're going to die in that space decades down the road. I feel like there's something there that, number one, is extremely egregious and horrible to experience, the existential nightmare of dying in prison, never know what it's like to live as an adult in free society. I didn't have that experience. I had an out date. A lot of my brothers and sisters went in there, they were told they were going to die there. My brother Donnell was also actually given death penalty when he was a child. Before 2005, when they made it illegal to give a child a death penalty. I want to share also one thing that I think about when it comes to accountability. The scariest day of my life wasn't the day I stood in front of that judge and received a 25-year sentence. The scariest day of my life was when I met the victim's family, Pedro Martinez's family. And I went to Precious Blood Ministries, and I sat there in the parking lot in my car, heart racing, tearful, praying, crying because I couldn't get out of the car. I was terrified. And I felt almost in my mind the equivalent of what it must have felt like, and not to even give myself even a close approximate identity of this, but like what it meant to be crucified. I felt like I was going to be walking to a space where I was going to be ridiculed and violently attacked, perhaps. I thought I was going to walk into a space where I was going to be met with swift anger and resentment. I'll never forget when I pulled into the lot initially, I saw his family there congregating by the front steps. And the older brother, Gerard, looked at his family and said, "Let's go." And at first I thought because they perhaps despised me so much they couldn't see my face in that moment. But perhaps they didn't imagine after all these years they would meet me there in the parking lot. I remember finally having the courage to go up those steps, and I thought to myself, how do I go about even walking into this room? I'm walking into a room full of people. By the way, he had over a dozen brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews that were there. His mother and father had passed. And I remember heart racing, walking in, and I thought to myself, do I smile when I walk in the room? Do I look them in their eyes? I played a role in killing their brother and sister 25 years ago. what do I do when I walk in that room? And I'll never forget how, when I walked into the room, Father Kelly and Maria Pike had a small little cross handed to me. Father Kelly put his arm around me and walked me to the far space of the room. Slowly, I began to interact. And as I began to interact, I remember sitting down, and I saw one of the nieces and nephews there talking amongst themselves. All of them were watching me. And I remember not knowing what to say. And I heard one of the cousins say that he'd come back from Europe. He was traveling the world. And I remember eventually at one point, Father Kelly saw my anxiety. He pulled everyone into a circle room, a restorative justice space. And when we were there in that space, he said, I want you to grab the small ribbon on your chair and put it on your lap. And I remember him saying, I want you to name one person in your life that made a difference. That one person in my life was Pedro. Do I say his name? Would they be offended by that? But he saved my life, sadly. What I mean by that is, though I should not have never had that experience, I don't know where my life would be. I wouldn't be on this stage, quite frankly. I would have probably died in the streets like most of our black and brown kids do. And I had to say his name. And I share that because at the end of the day, that was the most scary moment I ever had. And little did I know, it was also the scariest moment of their lives. They too didn't know how to interact with me. They too didn't know how to approach me, although they came with bags of food. I had no idea that they had stood up all night cooking some of Pedro's favorite foods. They just wanted to know the truth. They wanted me to fill in the blanks. They wanted to know that Pedro didn't suffer. They wanted to know that the people who were responsible for this, quite frankly, for their own healing, were not monsters. The ripple effect of trauma, of violence, of the loss of Pedro had traveled through the generations. His nieces and nephews had watched their mothers and fathers growing up crying throughout the years of his memory. Sadly, at the time of Pedro's passing, 2 of his sisters had miscarriages. One didn't even know she was pregnant. I share all this to say that our communities are getting fucked up out there. We're the ones who are suffering. No one is seeing who we are. Pedro and I were no different from one another. Pedro's on the other side of the viaduct. He got sent across that viaduct at midnight by the older adults in his gang to come and shoot at us. He had a gun in his back pocket. Sadly, he was lured into a building and was killed. I say that because he was a child just like I was. We were just children. I was scared that day. I was scared for Pedro. I was afraid of the adults that surrounded us. The sociopathic adult who led my gang, I was afraid of that man. And when I sat across the street and heard his life being taken away violently, I cried. And I ran home and I laid on my mother's couch and I asked God to forgive me. We were never monsters. And I don't give a fuck what nobody says. We're not monsters. No child is born bad.
There is nothing left to say.
Seriously.
But I will just say this one thing. If you ever would like to know the measure of a man, it's one who is afraid to do the right thing and how he will be judged and does it anyway. That, my friends, is just. Thank you. Thank you all.